I was swiping through this new dating app last night and, Ellie, I found David's profile, active as of yesterday. My best friend Megan's words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my entire body go numb as I stared at the screenshot she'd sent, my husband of 8 years smiling back at me. The same photo I had taken during our anniversary trip to Monterey last month. His status read, "Recently separated and excited to meet someone new." We weren't separated. At least, I hadn't been informed that we were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Anything exciting happened today? David asked casually that evening, placing his phone face down on the counter as he entered our kitchen. I noticed how he positioned his body between me and the device, a subtle gesture that suddenly held new meaning. Just the usual work drama, I replied, continuing to chop vegetables for the dinner I no longer had an appetite for. How about you? Same old meetings, he said, opening the refrigerator. Mind if I go for a run before dinner? Need to clear my head after being cooped up. All day, I watched as he checked his watch, the one I'd saved for months to buy him last Christmas, and how his thumb reflexively swiped across his phone screen to check for notifications. Sure, take your time, I said, my voice impressively steady. I'll keep your portion warm. As soon as the front door closed behind him, I stood motionless in our kitchen, the knife still in my hand. The granite countertop, the one David had insisted was worth the extra expense during our renovation, felt cold beneath my fingertips as I steadied myself. In 8 years of marriage, I had never once suspected David of being unfaithful. We had met at a mutual friend's wedding where he'd charmed me with his quick wit and attentive nature. 6 months later, he proposed during a sunrise hike at Point Reyes, telling me he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. I believed him. We had built what I thought was a solid life together, the charming craftsman home we'd renovated room by room, our plans to start a family next year, the inside jokes and comfortable routines. Last week, we'd even discussed names for our future children while curled up on the porch swing he'd installed for my birthday. And yet, while I had been researching fertility options, my husband had been crafting a dating profile, presenting himself as single and available. My name is Eleanor Chen. I'm 34 years old, and this was the moment I realized my marriage was built on quicksand. Not just because of a dating profile, though that revelation was devastating enough, but because of the calculated deception behind it. The evidence that the person I trusted most had been methodically planning his exit while maintaining a perfect facade of commitment. I placed the knife down carefully and reached for my phone. The screenshot Megan had sent stared back at me, taunting me with details I hadn't fully processed the first time. David had written that he was financially secure and independent, conveniently omitting that the down payment for our house had come from my inheritance after my father passed away. He listed himself as fit, adventurous, and spontaneous, qualities I had encouraged in him when he'd been trapped in a corporate job he hated, supporting him through a career change that had required me to work overtime for nearly 2 years. His profile mentioned loving to travel, but nothing about how my connections as a marketing executive in the tourism industry had made most of those trips possible at discounted rates. He described himself as a great cook who loves entertaining, skills I had patiently taught him after discovering his idea of a home-cooked meal was boxed pasta with jarred sauce. My throat tightened as I scrolled through his other photos, all taken by me, during moments I had treasured. There was David on the boat in San Diego, the wind tousling his hair as he smiled into the camera. David at his brother's wedding, looking handsome in his tailored suit. David hiking in Yosemite, arms outstretched against the backdrop of half dome. Each image a memory I had cherished, now repurposed to attract other women. The more I read, the more surreal it became. His description painted the picture of a man I barely recognized, or rather, a man who existed because of my support, encouragement, and love, now marketed as a self-made individual ready to share his life with someone new. My finger hovered over the call button. I could confront him right now, demand explanations, dissolve into justified anger and hurt. That's what he would expect. That's what would give him the moral high ground to claim I was emotional and impossible to reason with. Phrases I'd heard him use when describing his friend's messy divorce. I'd witnessed firsthand how David characterized conflicts. Just last month, when our neighbors separated, he'd commented over dinner. Mark said Sarah went absolutely ballistic when she found out he'd been unhappy. Threw his clothes on the lawn, changed the locks, typical unhinged behavior. No wonder he couldn't talk to her about his feelings. I had nodded sympathetically then, not realizing I was being handed the script for my own marriage's demise. No. Confrontation would only play into his narrative. It would give him the justification he seemed to be looking for. A dramatic scene he could recount to friends, family, and potential dates as evidence that leaving was his only option. Instead, I took a deep breath and set my phone down on the counter. Megan had texted again. "What are you going to do? Want me to come over?" "Not tonight," I replied. "I need to think. Thank you for telling me." I resumed preparing dinner, mechanically slicing bell peppers and mushrooms for the stir-fry David had requested this morning before leaving for work. Before I'd known my life was unraveling. I arranged the vegetables in neat piles, the precise order a small comfort amid the chaos of my thoughts. David would return from his run in exactly 42 minutes. He was nothing if not consistent with his 5-mile route. I would serve dinner, ask about his day, and laugh at his jokes. Nothing would appear different. But everything had changed. The home I had thought was my sanctuary now felt like an elaborate stage set. The marriage I had believed in seemed no more real than the recently separated status on his profile. As I measured rice into the cooker, 2 cups, not 1.5 as the instructions suggested, because David preferred his rice with a bit more substance, I made a silent promise to myself. David had created his exit strategy without my knowledge. Now I would create mine without his. Tonight, I would be the perfect wife. Tomorrow, I would begin gathering information. And in the coming weeks, I would ensure that when our marriage ended, as it inevitably would, it would happen on my terms, not his. I heard the familiar beep of his fitness watch as the front door opened. David was back, right on schedule. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, pasted on a smile, and turned to greet my husband as if I hadn't just discovered he was already gone. I've always been the type of person who thinks before acting. My mother called it being methodical to a fault, while my father praised it as strategic patience. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants in a predominantly white suburb of Seattle shaped me in ways I'm still discovering. My parents had sacrificed everything for stability and opportunity, instilling in me a deep appreciation for careful planning and measured risks. When other kids were impulsively signing up for activities based on what their friends chose, I would research each option, weighing the benefits against the time commitment. By 14, I had plotted my academic trajectory through college on a color-coded spreadsheet. This wasn't out of pressure from my parents, though they certainly approved, but because I found comfort in mapping the path ahead. "Eleanor has an old soul," my father once told a family friend. "She understands that success is not about quick victories, but sustained progress." Coming from him, a man who had rebuilt his entire life after leaving Shanghai with nothing but a single suitcase and an engineering degree, this was high praise. That methodical nature served me well academically and professionally. I graduated at the top of my class in marketing, secured a coveted internship at a tourism marketing firm during the 2008 recession when positions were scarce, and worked my way up to executive level by 30. My colleagues often marveled at my ability to remain calm during crises that sent others spiraling. The server crashed an hour before the client presentation, and Ellie just nodded like someone had mentioned it might rain later. my assistant Jared once recounted at a company happy hour. Then she outlined 3 backup plans in 2 minutes flat, while the rest of us were still panicking. What few people understood was that my composure wasn't about lacking emotion, it was about channeling it. When the housing market collapsed, during my senior year of college, wiping out half of my parents' retirement savings, I allowed myself exactly 1 night of tears. The next morning, I researched financial advisors, scheduled appointments for my parents, and adjusted my own post-graduation plans to provide additional support. Pragmatism was my form of care. This ability to compartmentalize served me well, in most areas of life, but had perhaps made me vulnerable in ways I hadn't recognized. Looking back, there were moments when David's mask had slipped, revealing glimpses of the person who could create a dating profile while his wife researched fertility clinics. 3 years into our marriage, during a dinner with his college friends, I overheard him describe our relationship origin differently than I remembered it. In his version, he had pursued me relentlessly, wearing down my initial resistance. The truth was that we had connected instantly, with equal enthusiasm from both sides. When I mentioned this discrepancy later that night, he laughed it off. "It's just a better story that way," he explained, kissing my forehead. "People love a good chase narrative." I accepted this explanation, filing away my discomfort rather than examining it closely. After all, wasn't that what marriage required? Flexibility, compromise, allowing your partner the occasional harmless embellishment? My parents had taught me that successful relationships weren't about perfect alignment, but about navigating differences with respect and patience. But there were other moments too, small deceptions that seemed inconsequential in isolation. The time he claimed to have been stuck in traffic when his location sharing showed him at a bar downtown. The work conference in Chicago that a colleague later mentioned had ended a day earlier than David returned home. The unexplained credit card charges at high-end restaurants on nights he supposedly had late meetings with clients who, when I met them at company functions, seemed unfamiliar with these discussions. Each time I accepted his explanations, convincing myself that my suspicions reflected my own insecurities rather than his untrustworthiness. My natural inclination toward evidence and analysis was suppressed in favor of faith in our partnership. This wasn't entirely due to naivety. Before David, I'd experienced relationships where my analytical nature was branded as suspicious or controlling. My college boyfriend had stormed out of our apartment when he discovered I kept a spreadsheet tracking our shared expenses. "Normal people don't document everything like it's evidence for a future trial," he'd shouted, missing the point that I was simply being thorough. After that relationship ended, I consciously worked to soften my approach, to lead with trust rather than verification. Perhaps I had overcorrected with David, ignoring signs that would have triggered immediate investigation in any other context. But beneath my cultivated trust, the core of who I was remained intact. A woman who valued facts, who believed in being prepared, who knew how to play the long game. These qualities that had propelled my career and stabilized my life through various challenges had merely been dormant in certain aspects of my marriage, deactivated by choice rather than absent altogether. Now, as I faced the most profound betrayal of my adult life, I felt these traits reawakening. The Eleanor who had meticulously planned her way through every obstacle, who had never acted without first understanding all variables, was returning precisely when I needed her most. The morning after discovering David's dating profile, I woke, before him as usual. For a moment, staring at the ceiling of our bedroom, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd learned. The pain was physical, a constriction in my chest that made each breath deliberate. I permitted myself exactly 3 minutes to experience this raw emotion. Then, as sunlight began filtering through our bedroom curtains, the Belgian linen ones, I'd selected while David was too busy to help with home decor decisions. I mentally shifted gears. I slipped out of bed and into my running clothes, careful not to disturb David. He stirred slightly, reaching across to my empty side of the bed before settling back into sleep. That unconscious gesture would have seemed tender yesterday. Today, it felt like one more performance in a relationship that had apparently been more theater than substance. As I ran my usual route through our neighborhood, I began cataloging what I knew with certainty versus what required verification. The dating profile was confirmed. Megan had sent screenshots showing recent activity. But was David actively meeting women, or was this profile part of preparation for a separation he hadn't yet initiated? Were there financial maneuvers happening that I wasn't aware of? Had he consulted an attorney? By the time I returned home, covered in sweat and with 4 miles logged on my fitness tracker, I had outlined my initial information-gathering strategy. I wouldn't confront David. Not yet. First, I needed a complete understanding of the situation I was facing. Back at the house, I could hear the shower running. David was awake. I filled a glass with water and leaned against the kitchen counter, mentally preparing to resume the role of unsuspecting wife. For someone who had never considered herself an actress, I was about to deliver the performance of my lifetime. The bathroom door opened, and David emerged wrapped in a towel, hair wet from the shower. He smiled when he saw me, that same warm smile that had once made me feel like the most fortunate woman in the world. Now I wondered how many others had received that same practiced expression. "Morning, runner?" he said, crossing the kitchen to kiss my cheek. "You're up early." I returned his smile, tilting my face toward his. Beautiful morning. Couldn't waste it. He reached past me for a coffee mug, his arm brushing mine casually. "Plans for today?" "Just catching up on some work, maybe lunch with Megan," I replied, watching his expression carefully for any reaction to my friend's name. There was nothing. No flicker of concern, no momentary tension. Either he didn't suspect that Megan might have seen his profile, or he was better at concealing his thoughts than I had realized. Both possibilities were unsettling. "Sounds nice," he said, pouring coffee. "I've got meetings until 6 or so. Want to do takeout tonight?" "Perfect," I agreed. "I'll order from that Thai place you like." He smiled again, seemingly pleased with this small evidence of my attentiveness to his preferences. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he was crafting an escape from our marriage, I was still remembering his favorite curry. As he disappeared into our bedroom to dress, I allowed myself a moment of clarity. The man I had married, or thought I had married, wouldn't have been capable of this level of deception. Either he had changed fundamentally over our years together, or I had been deceived from the beginning about who he truly was. Neither option offered comfort, but both demanded the same response. Clear-eyed assessment followed by decisive action. If there was one advantage to having my world shattered overnight, it was the sudden, crystalline perspective it provided. All the small compromises and rationalizations I had made to preserve my image of our marriage had evaporated, leaving only unmistakable reality. I heard David's phone chime from where he'd left it on the counter. Normally, I would never have considered looking at his messages, not out of naivety, but out of respect for boundaries I believed were mutual. Now, I glanced at the screen and saw a notification from the dating app, though the message content was hidden. In that moment, I made my first concrete decision in this new reality. I would not become someone I couldn't recognize in pursuit of the truth. I wouldn't secretly access his phone or install spyware or follow him through the city. There were other ways to gather the information I needed, legitimate methods that wouldn't require sacrificing my integrity, because when this was over, whatever this turned out to be, I wanted to emerge with my core self intact. David might have shattered our marriage, but he wouldn't destroy the foundation of who I was, a woman of principle, intelligence, and dignity. These qualities hadn't failed me. I had simply suspended them in service of a relationship that hadn't deserved such concession. As David called out that he was running late and would grab breakfast on the way to work, I called back a cheerful goodbye, already mentally drafting. the email I would send to my attorney friend requesting a confidential lunch meeting. The path ahead would be painful, but for the first time in years, I was navigating it with my eyes fully open. When I first met David Chen at Allison and Mark's wedding, I wasn't looking for a relationship. At 26, I was immersed in building my career at Horizon Marketing, working 60-hour weeks and loving every minute of it. Romance was a distraction I couldn't afford if I wanted to make senior manager by 30, a goal I had mapped out, with characteristic precision. David changed that calculation with a single conversation. While other men at the wedding tried to impress me with career accomplishments or awkward dance moves, David asked thoughtful questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. When I explained a tourism campaign I was developing for small businesses impacted by economic downturn, he offered insights from his perspective as a financial advisor that I hadn't considered. "You're not just selling destinations," he said, as we shared a slice of wedding cake at a corner table, away from the dance floor's chaos. "You're offering economic resilience. That's something worth marketing differently." By the end of the night, I'd not only given him my number, but reworked my campaign strategy based on our conversation. It was the first time I'd met someone who seemed to value my mind as much as anything else about me, would bring me coffee during late work nights, and sit quietly reading while I finished projects. I would attend his client appreciation events, genuinely interested in the financial strategies he discussed. We built our relationship around supporting each other's ambitions rather than compromising them. "We make sense together," David said on our 6-month anniversary, as we hiked to a secluded viewpoint in Discovery Park, like a business merger where both companies actually become stronger. I laughed at his corporate analogy, but understood exactly what he meant. We were partners in the truest sense of the word, each bringing distinct strengths that complemented the others. When he proposed 6 months later, it wasn't an emotional impulse, but a logical progression of something that worked exceptionally well. The first 2 years of marriage maintained this balanced partnership. We bought our house, a fixer-upper, craftsman that horrified my parents but excited us with its potential. Weekends were spent tearing out dated carpeting and repainting walls, David handling structural issues while I managed design elements. We argued sometimes, usually about budgets for renovation materials, but resolved disagreements through reasoned discussion rather than heated emotions. "This is why we work," David said one night as we compromised on light fixtures that balanced his preference for modern simplicity with my desire for character. "We can disagree without it becoming personal." I remember thinking how fortunate I was to have found someone who approached conflict with the same rationality I valued. Neither of us was particularly demonstrative or romantic in conventional ways, but we showed love through practical support and partnership. It felt solid, sustainable. The shift happened so gradually I can't pinpoint exactly when things changed. Looking back, I see the first subtle signs emerging around our 3rd anniversary. David's financial advisory firm was expanding, taking on higher net worth clients, and opening a second office across town. His hours extended, his stress levels increased, and his availability decreased accordingly. Initially, I adjusted without complaint. Hadn't he supported my similar work intensity early in our relationship? I took on more household responsibilities, managed renovation contractors alone, and rearranged my schedule to accommodate his unpredictable hours. These weren't sacrifices in my mind, but reasonable adaptations to temporary circumstances. Once we get the new office established, things will calm down, David promised during a rare dinner together, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I appreciate your patience, Ellie." But as months passed, the promised calming down never materialized. Instead, new priorities continuously emerged: client acquisition targets, office expansion plans, industry certification processes. Our conversations, once wide-ranging and intellectually stimulating, narrowed to logistics and schedules. Can you handle the warranty paperwork for the water heater? I won't have time this week, he would ask, already focusing on his phone before I could answer. Will you be home for dinner on Thursday? My parents want to visit, I would inquire, receiving a distracted nod without eye contact. Had these changes happened dramatically, I might have recognized them as problematic. Instead, they accumulated like sediment in a river, gradually altering its course without any single moment of noticeable diversion. Around our 4th anniversary, I received a significant promotion at work, the senior management position I had targeted since college. When I called David with the news, he seemed genuinely pleased. That's fantastic, Ellie. We should celebrate this weekend. But that Friday, he texted at 6 p.m. that a high-value client needed an emergency consultation. On Saturday, he had an industry conference call that couldn't be rescheduled. By Sunday, I no longer expected the celebration to happen and suggested we simply order dinner at home. I'm really sorry about this weekend, David said as we ate takeout on the couch, his attention divided between me and the financial news on television. Your promotion is a big deal. I'm proud of you. The words were right, but something in his tone made them feel performative rather than genuine. Was he truly proud, or simply saying what a husband should say? For the first time, I found myself analyzing our interaction as I would a client communication, searching for authentic engagement versus obligatory responses. This new awareness was uncomfortable, so I pushed it aside. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive or projecting my own work stress onto our relationship. David had always been straightforward with me. If something were wrong, surely he would say so. The following year brought another shift as David became increasingly preoccupied with fitness and appearance. He had always been reasonably health conscious, but suddenly our garage housed expensive exercise equipment, our kitchen shelves filled with protein supplements, and his weekend mornings disappeared into extended training sessions with a personal trainer named Trevor. It's important to present the right image to clients, he explained when I questioned the $3,000 cycling equipment that now occupied space meant for potential nursery furniture. People want financial advisors who appear successful and disciplined. Again, the explanation seemed reasonable enough that I accepted it, though I occasionally wondered why these image concerns hadn't been priority during the first years of his career. When he suggested I might benefit from similar fitness focus, I bristled internally but maintained outward composure. My work doesn't require the same physical impression management, I replied carefully. But I appreciate your concern for my health. He dropped the subject, but something in his expression suggested disappointment rather than understanding. Had my physical appearance become a professional liability for him? The thought settled uncomfortably in my mind, but didn't quite take root. After all, David had always known I valued substance over style. Our 5th anniversary coincided with a market downturn that kept David at the office until late every night for weeks. I arranged a small celebration at home, cooking his favorite meal and splurging on an expensive bottle of wine, only to receive a text at 7 p.m. that he would be extremely late, and I shouldn't wait up. The next morning I found him sleeping on the couch, still in his work clothes. The anniversary card I had left on the kitchen counter remained unopened beside him. When he woke, he apologized profusely, promising to make it up to me. Client portfolios are in free fall, Ellie. I couldn't leave them hanging, he explained, rubbing his eyes tiredly. You understand, right? You always understand. And I did understand. His explanation made perfect sense. But something else was emerging alongside my understanding. A profound loneliness. The partnership that had once energized me now seemed to consist primarily of my support for his priorities with little reciprocation. I do understand, I said, handing him a cup of coffee. But I miss you. He looked genuinely surprised by this statement, as though the idea that his physical and emotional absence might affect me hadn't occurred to him. I'm right here, he said, gesturing around our kitchen. We see each other every day. That response revealed more than any argument could have. In David's mind, sharing physical space constituted meaningful connection. The intellectual partnership and mutual growth that had formed our foundation had somehow become optional rather than essential. By our 6th anniversary, conversation between us had largely devolved into administrative management of our shared life. We discussed bill payments, house maintenance, and social obligations with efficient civility. David's firm had weathered the market downturn and emerged stronger, but the long hours and distracted presence continued unabated. When I broached the subject of starting a family, a plan we'd agreed upon before marriage, David suggested waiting another year until his newest business initiative stabilized. The request seemed reasonable, and I agreed without argument, though I couldn't help noticing we'd had essentially the same conversation the previous year with the same result. Our 7th year brought a new development as David began attending more networking events and industry conferences. Weekends frequently found him traveling to financial symposiums in other cities, returning with business cards and potential client leads, but little interest in sharing details of his trips. When I suggested accompanying him to a conference in San Diego, a city I'd always wanted to visit, he discouraged it. "It would be boring for you," he insisted. "Just meetings and shop talk from morning till night." I accepted this explanation, as I had accepted so many others, focusing instead on a home renovation project to occupy the increasingly empty weekends. If David noticed my withdrawal into independent activities, he never mentioned it. When our 8th anniversary approached, I proposed a weekend getaway to Monterey, a deliberate attempt to reconnect with the man who had once been my most stimulating, intellectual companion. To my surprise, David agreed readily, even taking the initiative to book accommodations at an upscale oceanfront hotel. That weekend remains vivid in my memory now, not because it rekindled our connection, but because it so clearly illustrated its absence. We walked along the same beaches, dined at excellent restaurants, and slept in the same bed, but interacted like polite acquaintances rather than life partners. I made multiple attempts to engage David in meaningful conversation about his evolving career goals, my recent project challenges, even our thoughts on current events, but each attempt met with brief responses before he returned to checking his phone. I took photos throughout the trip, including several of David against stunning coastal backdrops. In one particular image, the one that would later appear on his dating profile, he stood at sunset on a cliffside overlook, smiling into the camera with the kind of genuine warmth I'd once taken for granted. Looking at the photo later, I wondered who he was imagining behind the lens. Was it me? Or was he already mentally rehearsing for his next chapter with someone else? On our final evening in Monterey, sitting across from David at a candlelit restaurant as he responded to yet another urgent email, I considered asking directly if he was still invested in our marriage. The question formed fully in my mind, poised on the edge of utterance. But something held me back, perhaps fear of the answer, or simply exhaustion at the prospect of managing yet another difficult conversation largely on my own. Instead, I asked if he'd enjoyed the weekend. He looked up from his phone with a smile. That didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course," he said. "It was a nice break." A nice break. 8 years of marriage reduced to a pleasant temporary diversion from his real life. I nodded and returned to my meal, unaware that within weeks, the photos from this nice break would be repurposed for his venture back into the dating world, a world he apparently considered while sitting across the table from his wife. The day I discovered David's dating profile began like any other Tuesday. I woke at 5:30 a.m., completed my morning workout, and was at my desk by 7:15, reviewing presentation materials for an important client meeting. David had already left for an early breakfast with investors. At least that's what he'd told me the night before. I had no reason to doubt him then. Around 10 a.m., I received a text from Megan asking if we could meet for lunch. This wasn't unusual. We tried to connect at least twice a month despite our busy schedules. What struck me as odd was her insistence on meeting in person rather than our usual quick catch-up calls when time was tight. Can't do phone today. Need to see you face to face. Joey's Bistro at 12:30? Her message read. I hesitated before responding. My afternoon was packed with meetings, and stepping away for lunch would require significant schedule reshuffling, but something in Megan's phrasing suggested urgency, and if there was one thing I'd learned in nearly 2 decades of friendship, it was that Megan Matthews didn't create drama without cause. I'll be there, I texted back, already moving appointments and delegating tasks to create the necessary window. By noon, I had handled my most pressing responsibilities and was heading to Joey's Bistro, a quiet spot equidistant from both our offices. Megan was already there when I arrived, seated in a corner booth with 2 water glasses and an untouched bread basket on the table. She didn't stand to hug me as she typically would, another subtle indication that something was amiss. Thanks for making time, she said as I slid into the booth across from her. Up close, I could see tension in her expression, a certain guardedness I associated with her delivering difficult news to clients in her role as a human resources director. Of course, I replied, studying her face. Everything okay? You seem concerned? Megan took a deep breath, her fingers tapping nervously against her water glass. Ellie, there's something I need to show you, and I couldn't do it over text or call. I debated all night about whether to tell you, but ultimately, I'd want to know if I were in your position. A cold feeling settled in my stomach as Megan reached for her phone. Whatever this was, it was serious enough to cause my normally straightforward friend significant hesitation. I recently downloaded this dating app called Matchmaker, she explained, unlocking her screen. After the disaster with Kevin, my sister convinced me to try again. I've been on it for about a week, mostly just browsing profiles. I nodded, still uncertain where this was headed but increasingly apprehensive. Last night, I was swiping through local profiles when... She paused, fingers hovering over her phone. Ellie, I found David's profile, active as of yesterday. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. David? My David? On a dating app? It seemed absurd, a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps someone using his photos without permission. Such things happened. I'd read about identity theft on dating platforms. You sure it's him? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the sudden hollowness in my chest. Could be someone using his pictures. Without a word, Megan turned her phone toward me. There on the screen was unquestionably my husband, smiling in the photo I had taken in Monterey just weeks earlier. His profile was complete with biographical details. David Chen, 36, financial advisor, graduate of Washington University. His status clearly marked. Recently separated and excited to meet someone new. I felt as though the air had been sucked from the restaurant. The ambient noise of conversations and clinking dishes faded to a dull hum as I stared at the screen, reading. Words that dismantled 8 years of marriage in casual, cheerful prose. Successful financial advisor looking for genuine connection, his bio began. Love outdoor adventures, trying new restaurants, and stimulating conversation. After recently ending a long-term relationship that wasn't going anywhere, I'm ready to explore connections with someone who shares my drive and enthusiasm for life. Not looking to rush into anything serious, but open to seeing where things might lead with the right person. My hands were perfectly steady as I took Megan's phone for a closer examination. Each word felt like a separate betrayal. Each phrase, carefully constructed to attract attention, while erasing me from the narrative of his life. Ending a long-term relationship that wasn't going anywhere? Was that how he characterized our marriage? 8 years of partnership, support, and shared dreams reduced to a stagnant obstacle he'd overcome? There's more, Megan said quietly, reaching to scroll down the screen. He's been active. These are conversations from his message inbox. New images appeared, snippets of conversations between David and at least 3 different women. The exchanges were light, flirtatious, sprinkled with getting-to-know-you questions and subtle innuendo. In one thread dated just 3 days earlier, he'd suggested meeting for drinks at Cascadia Lounge, an upscale bar downtown where he'd claimed to be attending a client dinner that very night. "I thought you should know right away," Megan continued, her voice gentle. "I took screenshots of everything in case you needed them for any reason." I nodded mechanically, still scrolling through the conversations. One exchange from the previous week caught my eye. A woman asking about his separation, whether it was truly over or if reconciliation was possible. "The marriage has been over emotionally for a long time," David had responded. "Just tying up. Loose ends before making it official. No chance of going back. I've outgrown that life." Outgrown. The word landed like a physical blow. While I'd been researching fertility specialists and sketching nursery designs, my husband had been crafting an exit narrative in which I was something to be outgrown, like childhood clothes or an entry-level job. "Ellie?" Megan's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you okay? Do you want me to take you home?" The question was absurd enough to snap me back to the present moment. Home? To the house I shared with a man who considered me a loose end to be tied up? The very idea seemed ludicrous now. Yet as the initial shock receded, something else emerged in its place. Not the devastation or rage that might have been expected, but a strange, cold clarity. For the first time in years, the inconsistencies and subtle disconnections in my marriage formed a coherent pattern. The late nights, the weekend conferences, the gradually increasing emotional distance. They weren't isolated incidents, but components of a deliberate withdrawal strategy. "No," I said finally, returning Megan's phone. "I'm not going home yet, but I would appreciate those screenshots." Megan looked relieved to have a concrete action to take. "Of course, I'll send them right now." Her fingers moved quickly across her screen. "What are you going to do?" It was the obvious question, yet I found myself without an immediate answer. The conventional responses, confrontation, tears, immediate separation, all seemed inadequate to address the magnitude of this revelation. This wasn't just about infidelity or the intention to leave, it was about systematic deception. David hadn't just created a dating profile, he had constructed an entire alternate reality in which our marriage was already over, requiring only administrative closure. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted, reaching for my water glass and taking a careful sip. My throat felt tight, though my eyes remained dry. "I need to think strategically." Megan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Strategic? Ellie, he's on a dating app while still married to you. While you're researching fertility clinics, for God's sake." Her indignation was comforting in its simplicity, reflecting what I imagined was the appropriate emotional response to such a betrayal. Yet something in me resisted the expected reaction. Perhaps it was professional habit. Years of addressing client crises had trained me to assess situations thoroughly before determining next steps. Or perhaps it was simple self-preservation, a reluctance to fracture completely while sitting in a public restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon. "I know," I said quietly, "and I'm processing that. But rushing into confrontation without understanding the full situation would be premature." Megan studied my face with concern. "What more do you need to understand? He's actively dating while married to you. He's telling women your marriage is over when you had no idea." Her logic was impeccable, yet incomplete. The dating profile was indisputable evidence of David's intention to leave our marriage, but it revealed little about his broader exit strategy. Was he preparing financially for separation? Had he consulted an attorney? Were there other aspects of our life together that had been similarly misrepresented? "You're right," I conceded, "but this may be just the visible part of a larger deception. Before I confront him, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with." As I spoke, my phone buzzed with incoming messages. the screenshots Megan had promised. I glanced down to see 6 images capturing various sections of David's dating profile and conversations, each a digital fragment of my disintegrating marriage. "Thank you for showing me this," I said, meeting Megan's concerned gaze. "I know it. Wasn't easy." She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I debated all night whether to tell you, but you deserve to know the truth, however painful. The truth. Such a simple concept, yet so elusive in my marriage apparently. For years, I had operated on the assumption that David and I shared a fundamental honesty with each other, even as other aspects of our relationship evolved. Now I wondered if that assumption had been naive from the beginning. "Do you want me to stay with you tonight?" Megan offered. "You shouldn't be alone right now." I considered her offer briefly before shaking my head. "I appreciate that, but no. I need space to think clearly." What I didn't say was that I needed to return home and observe David with this new knowledge, to watch for other signs I might have missed, to understand the full extent of his deception. "At least let me drive you back to your office," she insisted. "You've had a shock." This time I acquiesced, recognizing that beneath my composed exterior, I was indeed experiencing a profound destabilization. The foundations of my life had shifted, revealing fault lines where I'd perceived solid ground. As we walked to Megan's car, my phone chimed with a text from David. "Thinking of picking up steaks for dinner. Sound good?" The casual domesticity of the message, as though he were simply a thoughtful husband planning our evening meal rather than someone actively pursuing romantic connections elsewhere, struck me as almost surreal in its audacity. For a moment, I stared at the screen, wondering what version of reality David occupied where such compartmentalization was possible. "Everything okay?" Megan asked, noticing my hesitation. I showed her the text, watching as her expression shifted from concern to disbelief. "The absolute nerve," she muttered. "What are you going to say?" I considered the question carefully. My instinct was to respond normally, to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed while I assessed my options. Yet doing so felt like participating in my own deception. "Steaks sound perfect," I typed finally. "I'll make that salad you like." As I pressed send, I felt a subtle shift within myself, not a breaking but a hardening, like metal tempered by unexpected heat. The woman who had woken up this morning believing in her marriage despite its imperfections was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood that the life she had carefully built rested on illusions maintained for someone else's convenience. "You're scaring me a little," Megan said quietly as we reached her car. "You're too calm." I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not calm, I'm focused." And I was. For the first time in years, perhaps, I was seeing my marriage with complete clarity. Not through the lens of commitment or compromise, but as it truly existed. The revelation was painful, but also strangely liberating. If David could construct an entire alternate narrative of our relationship, then so could I. Except mine would be grounded in truth and self-preservation rather than deception. Back at my office, I closed the door and canceled my remaining meetings, citing a family emergency. In a sense, it was exactly that, the sudden death of the family I had believed in. I needed time to process not just the emotional impact, but the practical implications of what I'd learned. At my desk, I opened the screenshots Megan had sent and studied them with the same attentive focus I'd give to a crucial client presentation. There were patterns here, information that might prove valuable. David claimed in one conversation that he had been emotionally checked out for at least a year. In another, he mentioned having his own place lined up within the next month. To a third woman, he described having significant assets set aside for his new beginning. Each statement provided a piece of the puzzle I was now assembling, not just of his infidelity, but of his broader exit strategy. The timeline, the financial preparations, the narrative he was constructing to explain the end of our marriage to others. I opened a secure document on my computer and began making notes, organizing what I knew versus what required verification. If David had indeed been planning his departure for months or longer, there would likely be financial traces, unusual withdrawals, new accounts, changes to investment patterns. As his wife, I had legal access to our joint finances, though David had always handled the bulk of our financial management given his professional expertise. The irony wasn't lost on me, the financial advisor potentially hiding assets from his own wife. But if there was one thing my career had taught me, it was that documentation and evidence were powerful tools. Whatever steps David had taken, they would have left traces if I knew where to look. My phone buzzed again with another text from David. "Got a nice Cabernet to go with dinner. Be home by 6:30. I stared at the message, trying to reconcile this mundane domestic communication with the man actively planning to leave me while portraying himself as newly single. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How many other seemingly normal exchanges had been similarly tainted by unspoken deceptions? As I prepared to leave the office at 5, I caught my reflection in the window, composed, professional, betraying. No sign of the seismic shift that had occurred in my life just hours earlier. It struck me then that perhaps David and I were not so different in our capacity for compartmentalization. The difference lay in our intentions, his to deceive, mine now to protect myself. Driving home, I mentally rehearsed the evening ahead. I would prepare the salad as promised. We would eat dinner and discuss our days. I would listen attentively as David described meetings that may or may not have occurred. And all the while, I would begin the process of building my case, gathering information, assessing resources, and planning my response. Because David had made one critical miscalculation in his careful exit strategy. He had underestimated me. He had assumed I would either remain ignorant until he chose to reveal his plans or react with emotional volatility when discovered. He hadn't prepared for the possibility that I might meet his calculated deception with equally calculated response. See. I pulled into our driveway and saw David's car already parked, unusual for him to be home before me. I took a deep breath and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were clear, my expression neutral. Perfect. Game on, I whispered to myself as I gathered my things and headed into the house where my husband waited, unaware that everything had changed. The next 3 days were an elaborate performance, perhaps the most challenging of my life. Each morning, I kissed David goodbye as he left for work. Each evening, I prepared dinner and listened to his stories about client meetings and office politics. I smiled at appropriate moments, asked relevant questions, and maintained the carefully choreographed dance of our marriage as though nothing had changed. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, I was methodically gathering information. The first, night after discovering David's dating profile, I waited until his breathing had deepened into sleep before carefully retrieving his phone from the nightstand where he always placed it. In our early years together, I would never have considered such an invasion of privacy. Now it felt like self-defense. The phone was locked, of course, but I knew the passcode, his birth year followed by mine, a sentimental combination he'd chosen when we first moved in together and apparently never bothered to change. Perhaps he thought I wouldn't check, or perhaps changing it seemed too suspicious. Either way, his oversight provided my first window into the extent of his deception. The dating app was right there on his home screen, not even hidden in a folder. Such was his confidence in my trust or obliviousness. I opened it and found myself staring at conversations with 7 different women, some extending back nearly 3 months. David had been methodical in his approach, maintaining regular communication with each, spacing out potential meetings to avoid conflicts. One woman, Sarah, according to her profile, had already met him for drinks twice. Their messages hinted at physical intimacy without explicitly confirming it. My stomach clenched as I scrolled through their exchanges. The David in these conversations was flirtatious, attentive, quick with compliments and thoughtful follow-up questions, the very qualities that had been increasingly absent from our marriage. He had scheduled another meeting with Sarah for Friday evening at a restaurant on the opposite side of town from our usual haunts. I took screenshots using my own phone, careful to capture the most relevant exchanges and meeting arrangements. Then I checked his email, calendar, and recent calls, building a comprehensive picture of his parallel life. His work calendar showed a client dinner scheduled for Friday evening, conveniently matching his date with Sarah. Similar client events aligned perfectly with other dates he had arranged through the app. Before returning his phone to the nightstand, I made one final check of his photo gallery. There, I found additional pictures he'd taken for his dating profile. Selfies in his car and gym, clearly taken when I wasn't around. But what truly chilled me was finding a folder of documents labeled New Start. Inside were photographs of an apartment I didn't recognize, rental listings for properties across town, and, most damning, a draft email to a divorce attorney requesting an initial consultation. The email was dated 6 weeks earlier, coinciding with the time he'd begun, pulling away more noticeably. The apartment photos were time-stamped just 10 days ago, during a Saturday when he'd claimed to be meeting clients for golf. He hadn't just been planning to leave, he had actively been establishing his new life while maintaining the facade of our marriage. I carefully closed all the apps I'd opened and returned the phone exactly as I'd found it. Lying back beside David's sleeping form, I stared at the ceiling, feeling strangely detached from the pain such discoveries should have caused. Instead, I felt a growing sense of resolve. The evidence was mounting, each piece confirming what I needed to know. This betrayal was premeditated, extensive, and nearly operational. The following morning, I called Megan from my office. "I need a favor," I said when she answered. "One that might make you uncomfortable." "After what that bastard's doing?" "Anything," she replied without hesitation. "I need you to create a profile on that dating app. Use photos he wouldn't recognize but make it his type. See if he matches with you." Megan was silent for a moment. "You want me to catfish your husband?" "I want confirmation of how far he's willing to go with someone new," I clarified. "The screenshots show he's meeting women, but I need to understand his approach, what he's saying about me and our marriage." "Ellie, you have the dating profile, the conversations with other women. Isn't that enough?" I considered how to explain the precision I needed without sounding obsessive. "It's not about gathering more proof of infidelity. It's about understanding his exit strategy. He's telling these women different things. To some, we're emotionally over. To others, he's already moved out. To another, he's working through the financial details. I need to know which narrative is closest to his actual plan." After some discussion, Megan reluctantly agreed. By that afternoon, she had created a profile for Natalie, a 32-year-old marketing executive with interests that mirrored David's. The photos were of her cousin who lived overseas and had given permission. Attractive but not model perfect, professional but approachable. Exactly the type of woman David had been engaging with most actively. While Megan worked on establishing contact with David, I turned my attention to our finances. As a financially savvy professional couple, we maintained both joint and individual accounts. The joint accounts covered household expenses and shared investments, while our individual accounts held our personal spending money and separate retirement funds. This arrangement had always seemed equitable and appropriate, until now. Using my online banking access, I began reviewing transactions across all our joint accounts for the past 6 months. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Our mortgage payments, utility bills, and regular expenses showed the expected patterns. But when I downloaded the full transaction histories and created a spreadsheet for deeper analysis, concerning patterns emerged. Small withdrawals, between $500 and $1,000, had been occurring weekly from our joint savings account, always on days when David typically handled the banking. Over 6 months, these withdrawals totaled nearly $15,000. Not enough to immediately trigger concern, but significant when aggregated. The withdrawal description simply stated cash or transfer with no additional details. More troubling were changes to our investment portfolio that David had made without discussion. Several long-term investments had been liquidated and transferred to accounts I didn't recognize. When I cross-referenced the dates with our conversations, I recalled David mentioning rebalancing our portfolio for better returns in passing, framing these moves as routine financial management rather than the systematic redirection of assets they now appeared to be. I needed professional help to fully understand what I was seeing. The next morning, I contacted Lauren Winters, a financial forensic specialist I'd met through a women's business network. I explained my situation without emotional embellishment, focusing on the patterns I'd identified and my need for clarity before making any decisions. "This is unfortunately common," Lauren said after reviewing the documents I'd shared. "Based on what you're showing me, he's been systematically moving assets for at least 6 months. The cash withdrawals are concerning. They're structured to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but add up to a significant sum. The investment liquidations are more problematic, particularly if they were acquired during your marriage." "What should I be doing right now?" I asked, taking notes as she spoke. "First, secure copies of all financial statements, going back at least a year if possible. Second, establish your own separate accounts if you don't already have them. Third, consult with a divorce attorney immediately. Washington is a community property state, but that doesn't prevent spouses from hiding assets if they're determined." I had already scheduled a consultation with Patricia Zhao, a divorce attorney known for her thorough approach to complex financial situations. My appointment was set for Monday morning, conveniently scheduled during a time when David believed I'd be in a client meeting. By Thursday evening, Megan reported that Natalie had matched with David, and they had begun exchanging messages. His approach was textbook, friendly but not overeager, asking thoughtful questions about her work and interests. When Natalie asked about his relationship status, his response was illuminating. "I'm technically still married, but have been living separately for several weeks. The paperwork is in progress. These transitions are always complicated, especially with shared assets, but we're handling it amicably. She's focused on her career, and we've simply grown in different directions." Living separately, several weeks, handling it amicably. Each claim was a fabrication, yet delivered with such apparent sincerity that I could understand how his targets would find it convincing. The most insidious lie was the suggestion that I was somehow complicit in or aware of this amicable separation, that we had mutually acknowledged the end of our marriage and were simply working through logistics. Megan continued the conversation with my guidance on questions that might reveal more about his timeline. When asked when he'd be officially single, David responded that he expected everything to be finalized within 2 months. He mentioned having his own place already, another lie, and suggested they could meet there rather than in public if Natalie preferred privacy. When Megan shared this exchange, I felt the first true surge of anger since discovering the dating profile. The calculated nature of his deception was breathtaking. Not just lying to me, not just pursuing other women, but constructing an entire alternative reality where our separation was already established and mutual. He was erasing 8 years of marriage before actually ending it, rewriting our history to cast himself as the reasonable party moving on from an amicably concluded relationship, rather than a husband actively betraying his wife. On Friday, I decided to verify one more element of David's double life. He had mentioned having an apartment already, the same claim he'd made to several women in his dating app conversations. The folder I'd found on his phone had contained photos of a modern one-bedroom in the Bellwood Apartments, an upscale development about 20 minutes from our home. While David was at work, I drove to the complex and approached the leasing office. I'm interested in seeing some one-bedroom units, I told the friendly agent who greeted me. My husband mentioned a friend. Recently moved in here. David Chen? He said the apartments were lovely. The agent checked her computer. Oh yes, Mr. Chen. He just signed his lease last week. Move-in is scheduled for the 1st of next month. That's right, I said smoothly. I think he mentioned Unit 512. She nodded. Yes, 5th floor with a city view. Would you like to see something similar? That particular floor plan is very popular. I spent the next 30 minutes touring a model unit identical to the one David had leased, making appropriate appreciative comments while mentally calculating what this meant for his timeline. The 1st of next month was exactly 3 weeks away. He had signed a lease but told women he already had his own place. He was planning to move out in 3 weeks but hadn't said a word to me about separation or divorce. The pieces were falling into place with disturbing precision. David wasn't just having affairs or considering leaving. He had constructed a comprehensive exit strategy with a specific timeline. Based on his messages, conversations, and actions, I could now see the plan clearly. Continue living in our home for 3 more weeks while finalizing financial arrangements, then move to his pre-secured apartment and formally announce our separation as a fait accompli. The dating relationships he was cultivating would provide immediate emotional support during his difficult transition. The methodical nature of his planning was almost impressive in its thoroughness. He had considered every aspect of his post-marriage life while giving no indication to me that our relationship was ending. How long had he been plotting this departure? How many nights had he lain beside me, planning his escape while I planned our future? That evening, as I prepared for David's return from work and his subsequent client dinner that I now knew was a date with Sarah, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The verification phase of my investigation was essentially complete. I understood what I was facing with a clarity that might have been impossible had I confronted him immediately upon discovering the dating profile. David wasn't just betraying me. He was attempting to orchestrate the complete dissolution of our marriage on terms entirely favorable to himself. He intended to blindside me with a separation that was already executed in practical terms, leaving me to play catch-up emotionally, practically, and legally. It was, I had to admit, a well-constructed plan that might have worked exactly as he intended, if not for Megan's chance discovery and my decision to investigate rather than confront. But now I had something David didn't realize. Time. 3 weeks before his planned move. 3 weeks to prepare my response to a betrayal years in the making. When David arrived home to change before his client dinner, I greeted him with a casual kiss on the cheek. "You look nice," I commented as he adjusted his tie. The blue silk, one I'd given him for his birthday last year. "Important client?" "Potentially," he replied, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. "They're considering a significant portfolio restructuring." I nodded sympathetically. "Don't rush home on my account. These meetings can run late when there's a lot to discuss." He looked almost relieved at my understanding. "Thanks, I'm not sure. When I'll be back? We might move to drinks after dinner to continue the conversation." "Of course," I said, smiling. "Good luck." As he gathered his keys and wallet, I noticed him check his watch, the expensive one I'd sacrificed to purchase during leaner times. "What are your plans for the evening?" he asked, a perfunctory question he probably wouldn't remember my answer to. "Just catching up on some reading," I replied. "Nothing exciting." After he left, I went to our home office and opened my laptop. Nothing exciting was perhaps the understatement of the year. I had verification to complete, strategies to develop, and a meeting with a divorce attorney to prepare for. Most importantly, I had a decision to make about exactly how to respond to David's elaborate betrayal. Because one thing had become abundantly clear through my investigation. I would not be the passive recipient of whatever exit terms David had designed. He had spent months crafting his departure, Now I would spend the next 3 weeks ensuring it didn't unfold according to his plans. Opening a new document, I titled it Exit Strategy Response and began to write. Monday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy, sunlight filtering through, our bedroom blinds, the familiar sounds of early traffic outside, David's rhythmic breathing beside me. For a disorienting moment, I could almost believe the past week had been a nightmare, that my marriage remained intact, imperfect, but salvageable. Then reality reasserted itself as David's phone chimed with a message. He reached for it instantly, angling the screen away from me as he checked the notification. His small smile told me everything I needed to know. Another woman, another message, another thread in the elaborate tapestry of deception he'd been weaving. Important client? I asked innocently, watching his expression shift from pleasure to practiced neutrality. Just the office, he replied smoothly. Team meeting got moved. Up! He set his phone down and stretched. I should get going early. I nodded, maintaining the facade of normal marital interaction that had become our routine. I'll be late tonight. Presentation for the tourism board. This was true, though I had deliberately scheduled my attorney consultation for earlier that day. One of the unexpected advantages of David's emotional withdrawal was his complete lack of interest in the details of my professional life. He acknowledged my statement with a distracted nod, already mentally elsewhere. After David left, I prepared for the most consequential day since discovering his betrayal. My appointment with Patricia Zhao was scheduled for 10 a.m., followed by a meeting with Lauren Winters to discuss financial protection strategies. By evening, I would need to make fundamental decisions about how to proceed, whether to confront David immediately, continue gathering evidence, or implement countermeasures without his knowledge. I dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal gray suit that projected both confidence and seriousness. As I applied my makeup with steady hands, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me appeared remarkably composed for someone whose life had imploded just 6 days earlier. There were no visible signs of the sleepless nights, no indication of the profound betrayal I was processing. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from necessary action, had served me well professionally. Now it would serve a more personal purpose. Patricia's office was located in a sleek downtown building with panoramic views of Puget Sound, precisely the kind of impressive space designed to justify her considerable fees. At 48, she had built a reputation as one of the city's most effective divorce attorneys, particularly in cases involving complex financial situations or high-conflict separations. The reception area featured muted colors, comfortable seating, and notably, no couples. Patricia's practice clearly wasn't aimed at reconciliation or mediation. It was designed for clients navigating the end of relationships, not their salvation. Patricia herself projected efficient competence, perfectly styled silver-streaked hair, a tailored navy suit, and a direct gaze that suggested little patience for emotional displays. After brief introductions, she led me to a conference room where I laid out the evidence I'd gathered: screenshots of the dating profile, financial records showing the pattern of withdrawals, documentation of the apartment lease, and the calendar. Entries confirming David's fabricated client meetings. The dating profile is actually legally insignificant, Patricia explained after reviewing my materials. Washington is a no-fault state. Courts don't particularly care about infidelity when determining asset division. I understand that, I replied. I'm more concerned about the financial maneuvers and his apparent preparation to blindside me with a separation after securing advantages. Patricia nodded, her expression shifting from professional politeness to genuine interest. That's where we need to focus. The financial documentation you've provided shows concerning patterns, the cash withdrawals, liquidated investments, and new apartment lease all suggest preparation for separation without disclosure. Is what he's doing illegal? I asked. not necessarily illegal, but potentially actionable in terms of asset division. Judges take a dim view of spouses who attempt to hide marital assets before divorce proceedings, but timing is crucial here. She leaned forward. You said he appears to be planning to move out in approximately 3 weeks? I confirmed this timeline, explaining the apartment lease details. Then we have a critical window, Patricia continued. Once he initiates separation, certain financial protections automatically trigger. But right now, you're in a vulnerable position. He's moving assets while you're still officially an intact household. For the next hour, Patricia outlined my options with clinical precision. I could file for divorce immediately, which would freeze marital assets but alert David to my knowledge and potentially accelerate his timeline. Alternatively, I could implement financial protections quietly while gathering additional evidence, maintaining the element of surprise for a more strategic response. There's no perfect solution, Patricia cautioned. Each approach involves trade-offs. The question is what matters most to you, financial security, emotional closure, or something else? It was a profound question that I wasn't immediately prepared to answer. What did matter most to me? Certainly financial fairness. I had no intention of being disadvantaged by David's methodical preparations. But beneath the practical concerns lay deeper questions about how I wanted this chapter of my life to end. I need to think about this, I told Patricia as our meeting concluded. But I'd like to at least implement the protective measures we discussed. She nodded approvingly. That's wise regardless of your ultimate decision. I'll have the paperwork prepared this afternoon. From Patricia's office, I went directly to meet Lauren Winters at a small cafe several blocks away. The financial forensic specialist had already secured a corner table that offered privacy for our conversation. I've completed a preliminary analysis of your financial situation, Lauren said after we'd ordered coffee. Based on the documents you provided, I've identified approximately $87,000 in assets that appear to have been moved or liquidated without clear destinations. The figure was larger than I'd anticipated, nearly a third of our joint savings. I'd expected some financial maneuvering but hadn't realized the extent. Can these funds be traced? I asked. Lauren's expression was guardedly optimistic. Most can be tracked, especially the investment liquidations. The cash withdrawals are more problematic. $15,000 in cash could be anywhere, including safe deposit boxes or even physical storage locations. She pushed a folder across the table. These are my recommendations for immediate action. First, secure your personal accounts by changing all passwords and security questions. Second, move a reasonable portion of joint funds, I suggest 50%, into accounts in your name only. This isn't hiding assets, it's protecting them from further depletion. Third, document everything, every conversation, every financial movement, every interaction with David. I reviewed her recommendations, noting how they aligned with Patricia's legal advice. Both professionals emphasized protection and documentation rather than confrontation at this stage. As our meeting concluded, Lauren asked the question that had been circling in my mind all morning. What's your endgame here, Eleanor? Are you looking for an equitable division of assets, or is there something else you want to achieve? The question resonated with Patricia's earlier inquiry about what mattered most to me. Both professionals were probing beyond the practical details to understand my underlying goals, something I realized I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Walking back to my car, I found myself contemplating not just what I wanted to happen, but who I wanted to be in this situation. The Eleanor who had entered marriage 8 years ago, trusting, committed, fundamentally honest, had been irreversibly changed by David's betrayal. But the woman emerging from this crucible still had choices about how to respond, what values to preserve, what kind of closure to seek. Rather than returning to the office, I drove to Discovery Park, the place where David had proposed years earlier. Finding a bench overlooking the water, I sat alone with the weight of decisions before me. The practical path forward was relatively clear thanks to my meetings with Patricia and Lauren. I could protect myself financially, gather additional evidence, and prepare for divorce proceedings with minimal disadvantage. But the deeper question remained: how did I want this story to end? I could confront David immediately, derailing his carefully constructed exit plan with the shock of my awareness. This would provide the satisfaction of reclaiming control, but might compromise my strategic position if he accelerated his timeline or became defensive. I could wait until his planned departure date, allowing him to believe his deception was succeeding while I quietly prepared my counter-strategy. This would maximize my practical advantage, but meant enduring 3 more weeks of living with his lies. Or I could craft a third option: neither immediate confrontation nor passive waiting, but something designed to provide both practical protection and personal closure on my terms. As the sun began its descent over the Sound, I reached a decision that felt not just strategic but authentic to who I was. David had spent months orchestrating an exit that protected his interests at my expense. He had rewritten our history, erased my agency, and planned to leave me scrambling to understand what had happened after he was safely established in his new life. I would not allow that ending to our story. Not out of vindictiveness or revenge, but because truth, even painful truth, had always been my foundation. If our marriage was ending, it would end with honesty, not convenient fictions. Pulling out my phone, I sent 2 messages. The first was to Patricia, confirming that I wanted to proceed with the protective financial measures immediately. The second was to Megan, asking her to continue the Natalie conversations with David for 1 more week. Then I opened a new document on my phone and began outlining a plan, not just for legal and financial protection, but for bringing this chapter of my life to a close with integrity and on my own terms. By the time I stood to leave, the document contained a detailed timeline spanning the next 3 weeks, culminating in a carefully orchestrated moment of truth that David would never see coming. Driving home, I felt a profound shift within myself. Not happiness, certainly, but a clarity that had been absent since discovering his betrayal. For the first time in years, perhaps, I was the author of my own story, rather than a character in someone else's narrative. David's deception had shattered the marriage I thought I had, but in its place, I was discovering something unexpected, a sense of self-determination I had gradually surrendered to the compromises of partnership. The path ahead would be painful, but it would be mine to define. That evening, as I prepared for my actual tourism board presentation, I received a text from David. "Running late at the office, don't wait up." I knew from tracking his location that he was actually at Cascadia Lounge, likely meeting another woman from his dating app. The lie was so casual, so practiced, that it almost seemed reflexive rather than calculated. "No problem," I replied. "Sleep well." As I set my phone down, I realized I had crossed a threshold. The decision had been made. The woman who had accepted such casual deceptions without question no longer existed. In her place stood someone new, someone who would not only survive this betrayal but emerge from it with her self-respect intact and her future firmly in her own hands. The game David didn't know we were playing was about to change completely, and he had no idea I'd just rewritten the rules. The hours after David left stretched endlessly. By 5:30 p.m., everything was prepared. My presentation loaded on the laptop, connected to our television, and folders containing evidence arranged on the coffee table. I wore a simple blue dress that made me feel both comfortable and confident. At 5:45, I texted Megan. He just pulled into the driveway. She had been parked down the street as promised. "I'm here if you need me," she replied. The front door opened at 5:52 p.m. David's footsteps paused briefly, likely noticing the living room lights, before continuing toward me. "Ellie?" he called, confusion evident. "What are you doing home? I thought you'd be at—" He stopped abruptly in the doorway, taking in the scene. Me seated calmly, folders arranged on the coffee table, laptop connected to the television. What's going on? He asked, shifting defensively. Please sit down, David, I said quietly. We need to talk. His eyes darted around, calculating. I thought you were in Chicago, I continued. Strange that your car is in our driveway. Color drained from his face. This single observation demolished his elaborate fiction. For a moment, he seemed frozen, caught between retreat and confrontation. Sit down, I repeated, my voice steady. Finally, he moved to the armchair across from me, perching on its edge like someone prepared for escape. This isn't what you think, he began, but I held up my hand. Before you create another story, I want to show you something. I pressed a button, and the television displayed my presentation. The truth about our marriage. What is this? David asked tensely. This, I replied, advancing to the next slide, is your dating profile on Matchmaker. Active for the past 3 months. The screen displayed screenshots of his profile, including photos I had taken during our Monterey trip and his recently separated status. David's expression shifted from shock to calculation to resignation. How did you... Megan found? 2 weeks ago. I advanced through slides methodically, revealing his conversations with multiple women, dates disguised as client meetings, his apartment lease, and financial maneuvers. With each revelation, David seemed to physically diminish. This isn't a complete picture, he attempted. Things between us haven't been right. I was going to talk to you after... After what? I asked calmly. After moving into your apartment tomorrow? After having dinner with Natalie on Friday? After transferring more assets to accounts I couldn't access? His eyes widened at the mention of Natalie. Yes, I know about that too, I confirmed. Every lie, every manipulation, every step of your exit strategy. Genuine emotion broke through his facade. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I was going to tell you once I was settled. You mean, once you had established your new life, secured financial advantages, and crafted a convenient narrative, you weren't planning to tell me everything. You were planning to tell me whatever version best suited your needs. He looked away. I didn't want to hurt you. This isn't about hurt, David. It's about respect and truth. You made unilateral decisions about our marriage while deceiving me. You presented yourself as single while sharing my bed. You planned a life without me while watching me research fertility clinics. I pushed divorce papers toward him. These include documentation of your dating activities, financial maneuvers, and your apartment lease. I'm not filing them tonight. That decision remains yours. But if we proceed with divorce, it will be with complete transparency. David stared at the folder. You've been planning this confrontation while pretending everything was normal. How is that different from what I did? The difference is that I'm telling you the truth now, to your face, before taking irreversible steps. I gathered information to protect myself after discovering your deception. I didn't create an elaborate fiction while actively pursuing our marriage's end. Silence filled the room. David finally opened the folder, scanning documents with the attention he once gave investment prospectuses. What do you want? He asked finally. I want what I've always wanted, honesty. Our marriage may be over, but how it ends still matters. I handed him financial documentation. This contains all financial activities I've undertaken since discovering your betrayal. Unlike your actions, mine are fully disclosed. So what happens now? He asked, closing the folder. That depends partly on you. I've secured my own apartment, implemented financial protections, and prepared legally. But I haven't taken irreversible steps that would prevent honest conversation about dismantling what we built. David was silent, processing the complete reversal of his plan. The power he had established through secrecy had evaporated. I didn't expect this, he admitted. I thought you'd be emotional, accusatory. I didn't prepare for rationality. I know, I said simply. You prepared for aversion. of me that made your choices easier to justify. But that version doesn't exist. It never did. Standing, I gathered my laptop. I'm staying at Janet's tonight. I'll return tomorrow and we can discuss practical next steps if you're willing to be honest. If not, our attorneys can handle communications. As I moved toward the door, David spoke again, his voice uncertain. Ellie, for what it's worth, I did love you. Maybe not at the end, but before. It was real. I paused briefly. I believe you. That's what makes your choices all the more incomprehensible. 3 months later, I stood in my new apartment, unpacking the last boxes. After our confrontation, David had proven surprisingly cooperative. Perhaps recognizing that transparency served him better than manipulation, or perhaps feeling genuine remorse. We had sold our house, divided assets equitably, and established separate lives with minimal legal intervention. Milo adjusted to apartment living better than expected, particularly enjoying our proximity to a dog park. I placed the last framed photo on my bookshelf. Not a wedding picture, but an image of myself hiking Mount Rainier before meeting David. I had been completely self-sufficient then, confident in my ability to navigate challenging terrain. It seemed an appropriate symbol for this new chapter. My phone chimed with messages, Lauren confirming our investment meeting, a client whose campaign was exceeding projections, dinner plans with Megan and Janet. Life was reconfiguring around new patterns and possibilities. Looking around my apartment, arranged exactly as I preferred, I realized that discovering David's betrayal had revealed more about me than him. It had shown my capacity for strategic thinking under emotional duress, my ability to maintain dignity amid betrayal, and my commitment to truth when deception would have been easier. The marriage I had believed in was gone, but the person I had become through its ending was stronger, clearer, and more authentically herself than before. Sometimes the greatest revenge against deception isn't exposing it to others, but refusing to let it define you.